welcome back to Snippet Sports Science, proudly sponsored by EliteForm.com. I'm Chris Cavillio, joined again 2 weeks in a row. I'm pumped. Welcome, Jared Coleman-Stark.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chris.
Good to have you here, mate. Now, 2 weeks ago, we started talking about the role of different heat adaptations on performance from a physiological but also a competitive standpoint. And we just started to go into the basics behind that. And we referred to really good meta-analysis which focused on heat adaptations around aerobic exercise. And the primary aim of this review was to provide this comprehensive overview of the effect of heat adaptation on physiological and perceptual responses to heat exposure on exercise performance and capacity in a hot environment. As we said 2 weeks ago, the meta-analysis reviewed 96 articles and summarized the current literature on over 30 performance, capacity, physiological, and perceptual variables. So therefore, very thorough overview on what heat adaptation can do on the body. What we wanted to do in today's podcast is actually go into the different components of what heat adaptation can do and just go through what literature is actually saying, and from that actually form a few practical recommendations that the authors have put forward for everyone out there. So by the end there, you can actually start to formulate perhaps the most ideal. Now, other little things that to take of consideration here was just the different lengths of heat adaptation. And we spoke about short-term, medium, and also long-term, looking at the different types of exposures in respect to how long each one would be. So with respect to this, a short-term heat adaptation protocol would be less than 7 exposures, medium 8 to 14, and long-term greater than 15. And just refreshing everyone's memory, there's not a lot of data out there on long-term heat adaptation papers, just because obviously in that academic type setting, these type of studies are quite hard to produce. In terms of temperatures, we're looking at around that 40-degree mark, and we're also looking at something around 90 minutes, give or take, depending on the type of protocol that the paper's actually looking at. So long periods of time, so 60 minutes, although some people have spoken up to 2 hours, around that 40 degrees, although there's a fluctuation from around 30 to up to 55 degrees in terms of literature. Did you want to kick it off there, Jared, in terms of the first area in the discussion point?
Sure. The first thing they're discussing here is just the ergogenic effect of heat adaptation. So that's what effect the heat adaptation has on performance. Is it enhancing performance? And it looks like heat adaptation has a moderate to large beneficial effect on subsequent exercise capacity and performance in the heat. The study showed that the benefit is dependent upon the temperature and duration of heat adaptation, but not on the maximal oxygen consumption or age of the participants. The size of the improvement observed was greater in capacity tests than in performance tests. So we're seeing about a 8 to 23% improvement in capacity tests. That's something like time to exhaustion, whereas there's only a 4 to 7% increase in performance tests. The capacity tests were more variable than the performance tests, as you can imagine, because it's a much more open outcome sort of measure that they're looking at there. The benefit that was observed was related to the duration of the heat adaptation protocol. And thus, when it comes to heat adaptation, the longer the exposure, the better. So although you're getting a lot of your benefits from those short-term heat adaptation protocols, less than 7 days, maybe even as short as 4 days, the longer you're doing heat adaptation, the more benefit you're going to be getting from it, the larger the effect sizes you're going to see. However, some of the short-term heat adaptation protocols, as I mentioned in part 1, actually had greater total heat adaptation exposure than some of the long-term heat adaptation protocols. And that's because the duration time, as Chris mentioned, was up to 2 hours in some of those short and mid-term heat adaptation, whereas in the long-term heat adaptation, they just had shorter exposure sessions. Unfortunately, performance data have seldom been recorded part-way during the heat adaptation intervention, as I was suggesting in part 1 would be very advantageous when you're doing a long-term heat adaptation protocol. You can take a mid-adaptation measure and then compare your short-term adaptation to your long-term adaptation. In one study in particular, it was reported that cycling performance was improved following 6 days of heat adaptation, which would be short-term, but it was further improved after 14 days of heat adaptation, which would be classified as midterm. While there are no data to categorically state that the number of heat exposures required for optimal performance or capacity gains There is data from 70 years ago that suggests that it might take up to a month to get the maximum benefits. There was a weak to moderate correlation between the ambient temperature used for heat adaptation and magnitude of benefit to exercise performance and capacity data. But as we mentioned in part 1, most of the research has been done right at about 40 degrees Celsius, and so I don't expect that they would have had a large enough spread of that data to be able to form a strong correlation. Thermal adaptation does require a series of sufficiently overloading thermal impulses exceeding an adaptation threshold. So what that means is that as the adaptation is occurring, the athletes become desensitized to the heat, and so you need to be increasing that thermal impulse, that stress that you're applying to the athlete for them to continuously adapt. We know this in resistance training more as progressive overload in terms of the load that we're using, but in this case, we do also need to progressively overload the heat stress that the athlete is experiencing. Only one study investigated the effect of different ambient conditions on heat adaptation. However, they did not measure exercise performance or capacity. While the current data suggests that there is a weak to moderate effect of temperature used in heat adaptation on the magnitude of benefit offered to exercise performance or capacity, this variable has not been systematically investigated. Interestingly, there was no correlation between the participant's age or aerobic capacity and magnitude of benefit to exercise performance or capacity data after heat adaptation. However, as with the ambient temperature, being almost exclusively at 40 degrees Celsius, the data are quite homogeneous. They used mostly quite fit, quite young athletes, and so we're not really able to discern differences from that independent variable. Some researchers, Powdoff and colleagues, reported that while exercise capacity was lower in young 21-year-old individuals compared to older 46-year-old individuals, pre-acclimation negated the advantage. All trials were terminated due to participants reaching the ethical cutoff core body temperature, and so while heat adaptation improved exercise capacity by 31% in the young participants, the older group effectively maintained their capacity during heat adaptation, only 1%. And that was a similar sort of issue that we ran into in my own studies, is that, especially with these studies predominantly using 40 degrees Celsius, and arguably aerobic exercise being a greater thermal stress as well, we ran into some ethical considerations that you can't overheat people because they are susceptible to heat injury. And you have to be very careful in your design of the studies in that regard.
Just on that point there, when I was reading this article, do you think that perhaps those younger athletes, especially in endurance, they have so much further to go in terms of reaching their endpoint? It's kind of like, we were speaking about with the results with your weightlifters, is that, if you have someone that's really well strength trained, how do you elicit those 1%ers? Very hard to do. But in the younger athletes, they've just got to keep training. They've got so much further to go. Do you think that's perhaps what they're trying to say here, that the older athletes, they're at their capacity?
I think that's possibly a consideration in terms, you're talking about the capacity in terms of how desensitized they are to exercise itself, and so they need novel stimuli.
Yeah, well, that was one of the strongest correlations I saw in my own studies, was that not necessarily the level of plateau, because one thing we were expecting was that as athletes are more plateaued, they'll respond better to novel stimuli. And it wasn't exactly plateau that was best correlated. It was actually just the years of training. So it wasn't plateau and it wasn't age. It was how long that particular athlete had been training competitively. And potentially, do you think that's what they're seeing here, is that you got someone who's been training for a much longer period of time and their ability to, improve in their exercise capacity is just less?
Right. It could definitely be very similar. Most people don't collect data on years trained, so we wouldn't really be able to make that determination. That's certainly not something that they looked at here. The closest marker they have is the age, which even then there's not as much data as there could be.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. They do talk a bit more about the fitness of the athlete. So there was a study by Chung and McClellan that reported 60 minutes of daily treadmill walking in the heat at 40 degrees Celsius whilst wearing, and I thought this was crazy, nuclear, biological, and chemical protective clothing.
What happened there in that study?
What they saw was increased exercise capacity by 5% and 1% in moderately and highly fit males, respectively. So if we take these into consideration, it suggests that there may be an effect of age or aerobic fitness on heat adaptation. But the meta-analysis correlation data didn't support that notion, so we can't really make any sort of final determination.
Going further in terms of what the actual optimal approach here, the authors suggest that the isothermal heat adaptation approach is best, and it's interesting to observe that the magnitude effect for this method regarding the enhancement of exercise performance and capacity was similar to that for the controlled work rate heat acclimation approach. Heat adaptation requires a progressively overloading thermal impulse to induce the changes, and so the similarity between the controlled work rate and isothermal methods, that's as surprising as says by the authors. Both of these approaches were less effective than the self-regulated approach, in which the participants are able to self-select the intensity. And this may have been due in part to the participants used. So going a little bit further, one author, Racinius, Schmidt, and Voltaire, used well-trained athletes and allowed them to undertake their normal training in elevated ambient conditions, whereas Wagner used healthy individuals able to undertake their usual recreational activities through the summer months. Massive difference here. It's possible that if the participants are sufficiently motivated, they self-select an intensity which provides a sufficient accumulative adaptation impulse to facilitate heat adaptation, and that less motivated individuals may self-select an intensity which is insufficient to cause heat adaptations. Obviously, this is speculative. I'm going to go on a little side note here. We've actually seen in elite athletes, in more that strength, speed, power type realm, they actually have higher levels of testosterone and they're more likely to self-select higher loads when training. And I think really what they're getting to is exactly the same thing. You have more elite athletes, they're actually going to self-select and they're probably in a really good training group. So the training group itself will probably help facilitate this improvement in intensity versus just healthy individuals who can self-motivate.
Right. One thing I observed in my experiments was that as the athletes experience the heat more, they would get into it more. It maybe relates a little bit more to the later sections we're going to get into on thermal discomfort and thermal sensation. But one thing I measured was their thermal preference. So it was a little bit different from sensation or comfort. But as they got hotter, their thermal preference would actually increase. And so I think that that could feed into the motivation and the self-selection a little bit more. And it could help explain a little bit why these different approaches to heat adaptation are more similar than we would expect.
Yeah, definitely. And before we get on to the effects of heat adaptation on the physiological adaptations, we'll leave you with a fact from one study. Zuralel reported that 6 days of passive heat adaptation, so that's 40 minutes of hot water at 40 degrees immersion, administered immediately after 40 minutes of exercise in temperate conditions, that's at 18 degrees, improved 5-kilometer time trial performance in hot ambient conditions, that's around 33 degrees Celsius, by approximately 5%. Therefore, this approach offers a real practical heat adaptation option for athletes, similar to what we do with athletes in the gym. As soon as they finish, we try to stick them in the sauna. This is a similar kind of response here. You finish your exercise, you keep the body nice and hot, and potentially the bits that we start suggesting in the next section, which is the physiological adaptations, are continued as a result of staying nice and hot.
And that study by Zuralel is very similar to the studies by Hamish McGorm, who we interviewed previously on the podcast, just for his review, not for his actual experiments in the same area. But instead of aerobic exercise, anyway, they would do resistance training, and I participated in this study actually, and then we would get into a hot water bath afterwards. So we also did the hot water immersion post-exercise, post-resistance training, and I think he saw quite similar results to that. So there's been a bit of development in that area.
Which then we'll just go straight on to the effect of heat adaptation on the physiological adaptations. And the first one is around body temperature. And what they found here is moderate to large beneficial effects of heat adaptation on reducing resting, mean, and comparable time point core temperature regardless of the measurement site. Interestingly, this reduction was not correlated with the participant's age or maximal aerobic capacity, nor the duration or the ambient temperature. The effects of resting core temperature were very similar between short and moderate time heat acclimation regimes, and the size of the effect was smaller in these two groups than in the single long-term heat acclimation investigation. But a reduction in resting core temperature of around 0.2 degrees Celsius is still likely to be physiologically important. While a reduction in this core temperature prior to exercise is not required for improvements in subsequent exercise, reductions in core temperature can improve subsequent exercise performance and capacity. It's been suggested that the majority of core temperature adaptations occur within 7 days of heat adaptation, and the data from the present meta-analysis offer supports for this. There were no differences between the effects of short, that's less than 7 days, and medium term, that's 8 to 14 days. However, the largest effect observed in the single long-term heat adaptation investigation suggests that adaptations can continue past this time frame. And that was something alerted to earlier, that they actually think timeframes of around a month is perhaps the most optimal. In one study, Patterson et al. Ensured that the thermal impulse was maintained throughout the heat adaptation regime by using an isothermal model, and reported that although there was no statistical difference between the reduction observed in core temperature after 8 and 22 days, core temperature was 0.2 and 0.32 degrees Celsius lower after 8 and 22 days of this adaptation protocol respectively. It's possible that if the thermal impulse is maintained, then heat adaptation regimes in excess of 14 days may offer additional benefit. However, this data from the long-term study was obtained from one study, obviously, and so therefore they're a little bit hesitant in terms of pushing this forward as a complete protocol recommendation.
There's quite a few physiological measures here. The researchers did look at 30 different outcome measures, so I think we'll rip through them a little bit, but one I think is particularly important is cardiovascular stability, as the impaired ability to exercise in heat is more often related to cardiovascular insufficiency rather than hyperthermia per se. And so any cardiovascular adaptations to heat adaptation would be potentially very important to an athlete. Improved cardiovascular stability can be demonstrated by the maintenance of cardiac output and arterial pressure despite reductions in heart rate due to compensatory increases in stroke volume. One researcher, Griffin, investigated the effects of 3 different heat adaptation approaches, varying based upon their ambient conditions, warm, humid, hot, dry, and radiant heat, and observed that regardless of the condition, heart rate adaptations occurred rapidly at the start of each heat adaptation regimen and plateaued after approximately 7, 7, and 11 days respectively. So relatively similar between those different types of applying heat adaptation. And it looks like most of the heart rate adaptation occurs in that first 4 to 5 days, and that full adaptation takes about 7 days. So we see very similar to what we were previously saying, that it looks like you can get that first level of adaptation at about 4 days, and then at each of these different time lengths that they're doing for the heat adaptation, there are additional benefits for each. While the time course of heart rate adaptations to heat adaptation does require further investigation, the reduction in heart rate for a given intensity as adaptation occurs is well accepted and supported by the data in this meta-analysis. Perriard and colleagues propose that as a result of the reduction in heart rate observed as heat adaptation occurs, heart rate could be used as a simple way to set workloads, which provides a consistent forcing function to ensure that a sufficient thermal impulse is maintained for effective heat adaptation. And just my opinion, but first of all, Perriard is an amazing researcher. They do really excellent work. I think that this is probably the best way, at least for aerobic exercise, to be maintaining that thermal impulse, is to just maintain the same heart rate, because as your heart rate adapts to the heat adaptation, then you can maintain the thermal impulse by maintaining that heart rate.
It's really good there. We're starting to see that this short-term, immediate heat adaptation type protocol can work, and we're starting to see that, using simple measures, and we keep referring back to this in all of our podcasts that we do, heart rate, it's so simple. We try and get fancy at times, but, how can we set workloads? That's one great way of doing it. So I think it's a really important that we, highlight this simplicity, yet the value in such easy measures.
All right, thank you, Chris, and thank you, listeners. We're going to have to wrap up there for today. Tune in next week for the 3rd installment of the Heat Adaptation miniseries. Please subscribe to the podcast and remember to turn on notifications so that you can be notified when the next snippet is released. Thank you for listening, and please visit our sponsor at eliteform.com.